When Mark and his wife moved into Willow Creek Estates, they thought they had found their slice of suburban paradise. The neighborhood was quiet, the homes were pristine, and the tree-lined streets felt like something out of a real estate brochure. But what they didn't fully realize, at least not until it was too late, was that Willow Creek wasn't just governed by a community of polite, like-minded neighbors. It was ruled with an iron fist by one of the most overzealous homeowners associations in the state, and at its helm sat Judith Klein, a retired teacher turned self-appointed neighborhood dictator. Mark was a self-employed electrician who had built his small business from the ground up. He owned a single work truck, a lifted red F-250 with his company's logo modestly printed on the doors. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't beat up, and it certainly wasn't in violation of any city codes. It was simply a necessary part of his livelihood. And like any normal person, he parked it in his own driveway when he came home at night. The first letter arrived within the week. It was folded neatly into a standard HOA envelope and dropped into his mailbox like a courteous bomb. The wording was vague but firm. It claimed that his commercial vehicle violated the HOA's aesthetic guidelines and would need to be relocated out of sight immediately. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in daily fines of $100. Mark was stunned. He reread the letter 3 times, confused about how a single work truck, clean, modern, and legally registered, could possibly be against the rules. He had flipped through the HOA's covenants before closing on the house, but like most people, he hadn't expected them to be enforced with such nitpicking precision. The document did mention something about non-passenger commercial vehicles being prohibited from overnight parking in driveways, but it seemed more directed at fleet vans or junky utility trucks. Mark's truck was neither. Initially, he assumed it was a misunderstanding. He wrote a short, polite email to the HOA, explaining that this was his only vehicle, that it was used for work, and that he had no alternative place to park it. The reply came not from the board as a whole, but directly from Judith Klein herself. It was cold and dismissive. According to her, the truck violated Section 5(2) of the HOA covenant, and aesthetic uniformity was essential to preserving property values in Willow Creek. She ended the email with a thinly veiled threat. Further noncompliance will result in escalated penalties. Over the next week, Mark began receiving daily fine notices, each carefully documented with time-stamped photographs of the truck in his own driveway. He couldn't believe it. The truck was parked neatly, wasn't blocking the street, and certainly wasn't an eyesore. But Judith wasn't budging. Every morning, without fail, a new notice would appear in his mailbox. It became clear that she was making a point, and she wasn't going to stop until Mark bent the knee. Mark started asking around. He talked to a few neighbors and learned he wasn't the first to get on Judith's radar. There was the family down the block who had been forced to remove a wooden swing set because it clashed with the neighborhood's neutral landscaping theme. Another guy had been fined $300 for putting up Halloween decorations before October 1st. It became obvious that Judith was on a personal crusade to maintain an obsessive level of control over the neighborhood, and she had weaponized the HOA's bylaws to do it. Still, Mark tried to play by the rules. He began parking his truck on the street just outside the HOA boundary, walking an extra block each morning just to avoid the daily fines. But then Judith escalated again. One morning, Mark woke to find a new notice, not just a fine, but a formal citation from the City Code Enforcement Office. It turned out Judith had filed a complaint against him for abandoning a commercial vehicle on a public street. The citation claimed his truck was parked too long without being moved, even though he used it daily. It was clear now that she wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was actively targeting him, using every tool available to make his life miserable. At this point, Mark was at a crossroads. He could continue bending to Judith's will, trying to fly under the radar and avoid more fines. Or he could do what few people dared to do in HOA-ruled neighborhoods. He could fight back. Mark wasn't a petty man by nature, But something about the way Judith conducted herself, hiding behind official titles, sending passive-aggressive emails, weaponizing bylaws, awoke something in him. A stubbornness, a refusal to be bullied. He started reading the HOA covenant again, line by line, word for word, and what he found was shocking. While the rules were strict about vehicles on residential lots, they had virtually no control over adjacent undeveloped land that fell outside HOA jurisdiction. And that's when an idea began to take shape. A tiny, overgrown parcel of land sat just beyond Mark's backyard, separated only by a line of shrubbery. The lot had been vacant for years, technically zoned for residential use, but completely undeveloped. Mark did a little research, pulled up property records, and made a few phone calls. The lot was privately owned by an older couple who had been trying to sell it for ages. No one wanted it because it wasn't connected to the neighborhood's utilities. But Mark didn't need water or sewer hookups. He just needed a place to park his truck. As he toured the overgrown lot, standing on the dry dirt and looking back toward Judith's pristine house, another idea began to form. Something more than a workaround. Something that would send a clear message. He wasn't just going to park his truck there. He was going to buy the lot and turn it into a fully legal truck yard, right next to the HOA president's home. The seeds of petty revenge had been planted, and Judith had no idea what was coming. Mark had never bought land before, not raw, undeveloped land, anyway. But after weeks of enduring fines, citations, and veiled threats from Judith Klein and her weaponized HOA, he was fully committed to the idea. Petty revenge was no longer just a thought. It had become a mission fueled by righteous frustration, a desire for justice, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of gleeful spite. The lot in question was just under a quarter acre. It sat immediately adjacent to Mark's property line, separated by nothing but a line of bushes and an old, leaning chain-link fence. The land had sat untouched for decades, overgrown with weeds and scattered with bits of construction debris, leftovers from a housing development that had run out of steam during the last real estate crash. Most people saw the lot as useless. It had no utilities, no paved driveway, no value to someone looking to build. But Mark wasn't most people. He didn't need plumbing or power. All he needed was dirt, space, and the legal right to use it. He contacted the owners, an elderly couple who lived 2 states over. They were more than happy to offload the property for less than market value. The land had become a burden: property taxes, weed abatement notices, the occasional trespasser. To them, it was dead weight. To Mark, it was his battlefield. The deal closed quickly. In just under 30 days, the land was his, free and clear, with the title transferred into the name of his business, giving it even more legal distance from the HOA's reach. Best of all, the property was not under the jurisdiction of Willow Creek Estates. It sat right on the edge, outside the lines of the HOA's meticulously drawn neighborhood map. The first thing he did was clear the lot. He rented a skid steer and spent a weekend flattening the brush, hauling out junk, and leveling the soil. The neighbors watched from behind their fences with quiet curiosity. A few even cheered him on discreetly. Mark wasn't the only one fed up with Judith's reign of tyranny. But not everyone was thrilled. It didn't take long for Judith to notice. Her house, situated 2 lots down, had a clear view of the parcel from her backyard balcony. When the machinery showed up, she was out within minutes, walking her little white poodle along the sidewalk, peering over the fence like a nosy prison guard. Mark ignored her. He didn't need to explain anything. The property was his. What he did with it was his business, as long as it was legal. And it was. He made sure of it. After clearing the lot, Mark brought in gravel, tons of it. He spread it evenly across the surface, forming a clean, stable base. Next came a wide rolling gate along the side access road, followed by a modest but sturdy metal carport on one side of the lot. Underneath it, he parked his truck. No more HOA oversight. No more tickets. No more fines. It felt glorious. But that wasn't the end of it. Mark wasn't satisfied with simply escaping Judith's grasp. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted her to feel the same helpless frustration she had inflicted on him. So he went a step further. He began inviting other small business owners in the area to use the space for free. A plumber parked his van there. Then a landscaper added his trailer. A mobile mechanic, who had long struggled with HOA parking restrictions in his neighborhood, asked if he could leave his work truck overnight. Mark welcomed them all. As long as they kept things clean and respectful, the lot was theirs to use. Within 2 weeks, what had once been an overgrown, forgotten patch of land had become a fully legal, privately owned mini truck yard, right on the border of Willow Creek Estates. And Judith was losing her mind. She began patrolling the edge of the neighborhood daily, taking photos from the sidewalk, scribbling in her notebook, and sending emails that Mark was never required to answer. She filed complaints with the city, but they went nowhere. The land was zoned appropriately, and Mark had followed every ordinance to the letter. The best part? Every morning, from her meticulously decorated breakfast nook, Judith now had a direct line of sight to a gravel lot filled with work trucks. Trucks with ladders, racks, toolboxes, everything she despised. And there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. Mark had flipped the script. She had tried to ruin his livelihood, leveraging petty rules and manufactured outrage to push him out. But instead of backing down, he had turned her obsession with control into a monument to her own powerlessness. Every truck parked on that lot was a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of victory. Word spread fast. Other neighbors started asking Mark for advice: how to deal with unfair fines, what legal options they had, whether Judith could actually enforce half the nonsense she cited in her memos. A quiet shift was happening in Willow Creek. People were waking up to the fact that the HOA wasn't a benevolent protector of property values. It was Judith, one woman, and her grip was slipping. But Judith wasn't going to surrender quietly. She doubled down, calling for emergency HOA meetings, proposing amendments to the covenants, and even trying to get a local council member involved. She made wild accusations, saying the truck yard was bringing down property values, that it was a public safety hazard, even claiming it attracted the wrong element to the neighborhood. Mark watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't attend the meetings. He didn't argue online. He didn't have to. The land was his. The trucks were staying. And Judith? She was unraveling. As the dust settled on the newly gravel-covered lot, the real battle was just beginning. Mark had made his move, but Judith wasn't finished yet. Her next play was coming, and it would be bigger, louder, and far more desperate. Judith Klein had never lost a battle. Not when she lobbied to ban basketball hoops from driveways. Not when she forced the Johnsons to repaint their door from eggshell white to approved ivory. Not even when the board voted against her motion to fine kids for sidewalk chalk art. She simply rewrote the proposal and passed it under a different bylaw. In her mind, she was the guardian of Willow Creek's community standards. And now, for the first time in years, her authority was under siege. The truck yard represented more than just a personal slight. It was a public humiliation. Mark had found a legal blind spot and driven a lifted F-250 right through it. Worse still, others were rallying around him. What had once been quiet grumblings from frustrated homeowners had become whispered alliances and late-night email threads questioning Judith's leadership. Her power, once absolute, was beginning to crack. She couldn't let that happen. Her first move was classic Judith: paperwork. She drafted a formal community impact report and presented it at the next HOA board meeting, complete with color-coded charts, grainy photos of the truck yard, and a spreadsheet estimating depreciation of neighborhood property values due to industrial blight. It was all speculation, of course. She had no actual data, but she made it sound official, and to Judith, that was enough. She demanded the board vote to take legal action against Mark, alleging that his business activity, even outside the HOA boundary, had a negative influence on the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. But for once, the board didn't immediately fall in line. Some members hesitated. Others outright objected. One even pointed out that the truck yard wasn't under their jurisdiction. Mark owned the land. He was in compliance with city code, and they had no legal grounds to intervene. Judith was furious. She stormed out of the meeting, furious that her fellow board members were going soft. That night, she sent out an emergency community update email to all residents, warning that commercial activity is encroaching on our peaceful community and urging homeowners to attend a special session of the HOA scheduled for the following week. Mark, of course, was included on the email. He didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to, because Judith's next move would do more damage to her than to anyone else. She went public. After realizing the HOA board wouldn't authorize legal action, Judith took matters into her own hands. She contacted a local news outlet, hoping to stir public outrage. She gave an interview in front of her meticulously manicured home, framed perfectly with American flags, white shutters, and neatly trimmed hedges. In the interview, she described the truck yard as an unsightly mess, accused Mark of disregarding community values, and made veiled references to a rise in suspicious vehicles since the trucks started appearing. She even suggested that property crime had increased, despite there being no police reports to support the claim. What Judith hadn't expected, though, was the public response. The story aired online the next day, and it didn't go as planned. The comments section exploded. Viewers overwhelmingly sided with Mark. Hundreds of people praised his creativity and petty revenge. Others shared their own HOA horror stories. A few even identified Judith by name, posting screenshots of her HOA memos that had somehow made their way onto social media. Memes were made. TikToks followed. The story went viral within the local community and beyond. Suddenly, Judith wasn't the protector of suburban values. She was the villain in a David versus Goliath battle. Except in this version, David had a gravel lot and a diesel engine. And Mark? He stayed quiet. He didn't post on social media. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't gloat or retaliate. But every time a new truck parked on his lot, clean, well-kept, and entirely legal, it spoke volumes. Judith's frustration turned into obsession. She began photographing the lot daily. She created binders of supposed violations. She filed complaint after complaint with the city, only to receive polite but firm responses that everything was in order. Her desperation reached new heights when she tried to circulate a petition to rezone the lot under HOA control, an impossible move without unanimous support from local property owners. Mark received a copy of the petition and signed. He placed it under the wheel of his truck, took a photo, and let it be. But Judith wasn't done. She began targeting other residents, anyone who had publicly or privately supported Mark. A neighbor who had waved at him one morning received a notice about their non-regulation trash can. Another family with a child who played in the front yard was fined for unauthorized lawn wear. She started auditing home exterior paint colors, demanding proof of prior approvals, and issued blanket warnings for things like improperly placed garden decorations. The neighborhood began to turn on her. Anonymous letters showed up in her mailbox. Some homes stopped paying HOA dues entirely. A few brave homeowners began talking about removing her from the board, something that hadn't even been considered before. Mark watched it all unfold with careful distance. He never engaged, never antagonized, never responded to the chaos Judith was creating. He let her unravel. And she did. She began pacing her driveway at odd hours. She planted tall hedges along her fence line in a failed attempt to block the view of the truck yard. She filed a noise complaint against a truck that hadn't moved in 2 days. She began calling the city so frequently that a code enforcement officer visited her home personally, asking her to stop harassing their department with baseless claims. Still, she pushed forward. Still, she obsessed. Still, She plotted her final, desperate move, one that she believed would destroy Mark once and for all. She was going to sue. Not through the HOA, not with board support, and not for actual damages. She planned to file a personal nuisance lawsuit against Mark and his business, accusing him of disturbing the peace, reducing her property value, and causing her emotional distress. It was a Hail Mary, a long shot, a final grasp for power, and it would come with serious consequences. Judith Klein had always believed in the power of paperwork. Letters, fines, citations, she wielded them like weapons. But when all her usual tactics failed, she turned to something far more aggressive, a personal lawsuit. Her claim was simple on paper, though steeped in the kind of emotional language she hoped would win sympathy from a judge. The filing accused Mark of creating a public nuisance, lowering the value of adjacent properties, and causing undue emotional distress due to the visual and auditory intrusion of his truck yard. She even attached images, dozens of them, showing trucks parked on gravel, lights from trailers during early morning hours, and screenshots of online comments mocking her HOA leadership. The suit wasn't about money. She was only seeking a symbolic amount in damages, $1,000. But her real goal was to force a court order that would shut the truck yard down. If she could argue that it constituted a nuisance, the judge might compel Mark to cease operations or impose restrictions that would make the lot unusable. She filed in small claims court, believing that Mark wouldn't want to bother with legal fees or court appearances. She imagined he'd be intimidated, maybe even back down before the court date. But Judith didn't know Mark as well as she thought she did. The lawsuit was the final straw. Mark had tolerated the fines. He had endured the citations. He had even ignored the public shaming. But being dragged into court, having his business and character attacked with false claims, was too far. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. This was personal, and it was public. So he fought back. He hired a local attorney, not a high-profile litigator, but someone smart, detail-oriented, and intimately familiar with municipal code. Together, they built a meticulous response to Judith's complaint, dismantling every accusation line by line. The first argument was jurisdictional. Mark's land was not part of the HOA. Judith had no standing to enforce HOA rules or expectations beyond its boundaries. The property was zoned residential with allowances for vehicle storage, and Mark wasn't operating a commercial facility. He was simply storing vehicles he owned or had been granted permission to store by others. The second argument targeted the nuisance claim. There was no excessive noise, no pollution, no foot traffic, no code violations. Mark had even installed motion-activated lights and cameras for security, features that exceeded city safety recommendations. The lot was neat, organized, and used only during daytime hours. In fact, the trucks were quieter than the landscapers who serviced half the neighborhood weekly. But the most compelling part of the defense came from Judith herself. Her own social media posts, emails, and interview with the news station were now part of the record. In them, she made clear that her actions were not motivated by public interest or real harm, but by personal vendetta. She had admitted, both online and in writing, that her campaign against Mark was rooted in her belief that his truck was out of character for the neighborhood and an eyesore. That kind of language, paired with her repeated and escalating behavior, painted a picture not of a concerned neighbor, but of a harasser. In court, the case was brief. Judith arrived flanked by a printed binder nearly 3 inches thick. She dressed formally, as if preparing for trial on national television. She spoke at length about the sanctity of suburban aesthetics and how she had sacrificed years of her life, preserving the neighborhood's charm. But the judge, clearly unimpressed, redirected the discussion toward the legal merits of her claims. Mark's attorney was calm, methodical, and devastatingly effective. The case unraveled in under 20 minutes. The judge dismissed the suit entirely. No damages, no orders, no restrictions. Not only that, but she issued a stern warning to Judith about potential abuse of legal processes. Filing baseless nuisance claims could open her up to civil penalties in the future. But that wasn't the end of it. Mark's attorney had filed a counterclaim. It wasn't a large one, but it was calculated. Mark wasn't after money. What he wanted was an official cease and desist order to stop Judith from harassing him, his family, or his business any further. The judge agreed. The order was granted. Effective immediately, Judith was legally barred from contacting Mark, interfering with his property, or filing additional complaints without evidence of an actual crime or violation. In short, she was silenced, and the fallout was immediate. News of the court's decision spread quickly. Neighbors who had been on the fence about the truck yard now had no reason to oppose it. Those who had quietly supported Mark began speaking up more openly. HOA board members, once intimidated by Judith's domineering presence, started holding meetings without her. One even suggested a vote of no confidence. Judith, for the first time in years, found herself without allies. She retreated inward. Her morning patrols stopped. Her daily reports to city code enforcement ceased. The weekly community integrity newsletter she used to email to residents? Gone. Her carefully trimmed hedges grew wild at the edges. Her porch lights stayed off. Neighbors whispered that she'd stopped answering her door altogether. And as for Mark, he expanded. With the lawsuit behind him, he invested in additional upgrades to the lot. He added a second carport, installed a security gate with keypad access, added signage for Willow Creek trade parking, private use only. It wasn't a business, technically, but it now had the polish and professionalism of one. And it was all perfectly legal. More tradespeople began asking if they could use the space. Retired contractors, local delivery drivers, even a retired firefighter who now ran a mobile welding service. Mark didn't charge a dime. He didn't need to. The satisfaction of beating the HOA at its own game was reward enough. What started as one man's solution to an unfair fine had become a quiet rebellion, a statement against the overreach of HOA authority and the petty tyrants who weaponize rules to control others. Judith had tried everything to maintain power, but in the end, it wasn't Mark who destroyed her reign. She did it herself. Judith's downfall wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen with a public outburst or a grand resignation. It was slower, sadder, and much quieter, like the fading of a storm that had once seemed unstoppable. After the lawsuit was dismissed and the cease and desist order issued, Judith's influence in Willow Creek Estates collapsed almost overnight. Her once daily emails to residents vanished. The HOA board meetings she used to control with precision and fear were now open, loosely attended, and strangely calm. Where once she'd sat at the head of the table, clutching her printed agendas and issuing commands like a suburban general, her seat now sat empty, its absence saying more than her presence ever did. Mark, of course, didn't gloat. He had no reason to. His truck yard, now unofficially dubbed the Freedom Lot by several amused neighbors, was fully operational. Trucks came and went, always clean, always quiet, always within the boundaries of the law. A few homeowners were still skeptical, but most had warmed up to the idea. For every person who saw it as a blight, there were 3 who appreciated its symbolism, standing up against bullying, resisting unnecessary control, and choosing logic over blind rule following. But something even more interesting began to happen. People started asking questions, not about Mark or the lot, but about the HOA itself. For years, Judith had led with an authoritarian grip, backed by a board too afraid or indifferent to challenge her. Most homeowners had never even read the HOA bylaws. They simply paid their dues and hoped to stay out of trouble. But now, in the wake of her very public defeat, residents were beginning to dig deeper. Some found rules that seemed outdated. Others uncovered inconsistencies in how violations had been enforced. One man realized he'd been fined for a fence that had actually been compliant with the original guidelines. But Judith had rewritten those guidelines in a quiet board meeting that no one attended. A small group of homeowners began meeting on weekends to review HOA documents. They found that Judith had modified several covenants over the years by barely legal means, often calling emergency meetings with only 2 or 3 board members present, barely meeting quorum. Many of these rule changes were never properly ratified by the community. They weren't just annoying. They were invalid. Momentum grew. By early spring, the group had collected enough signatures to call for a special election to restructure the HOA board entirely. For the first time in a decade, real democracy had returned to Willow Creek Estates. Mark didn't run for a board seat. He had no desire to be part of the politics. But he did agree to speak at the community gathering where the vote was held. In a short, clear speech, he reminded everyone why this all started. Not because of a truck, but because of control. About how rules, even well-intentioned ones, can become tools of harassment in the wrong hands. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't ask for votes. He simply asked that the HOA return to its original purpose, maintaining shared spaces, resolving real issues, and supporting, not policing, its residents. The vote wasn't close. Judith was formally removed from the board, along with 2 of her most loyal allies. They were replaced by a group of residents who had previously kept their heads down but were now emboldened by the change in tone and energy. People who had lived in Willow Creek for years without ever attending a meeting were now raising their hands to volunteer. The culture of the HOA was shifting from fear and control to openness and service. And Judith? She stayed inside. Occasionally, neighbors would see her through the curtains, watching the world move on without her. She no longer walked her dog past the truck yard. She no longer trimmed her hedges with military precision. The woman who once dictated the neighborhood's every decorative flagpole and flower bed had become a ghost in her own kingdom. Some residents felt sorry for her. Others didn't. But everyone agreed on one thing. The neighborhood was finally breathing again. The newly formed HOA board's first act was to repeal several of Judith's more ridiculous policies, starting with the infamous no work vehicle rule. They clarified that as long as a vehicle was legally registered, clean, and didn't obstruct traffic or create a safety issue, it could be parked in a driveway. Mark moved his truck back home that same week, not because he had to, but because the principle had been settled. The Freedom Lot remained open, of course, and continued to serve as a parking haven for a small group of local contractors who had long struggled with HOA restrictions in their own neighborhoods. It was no longer a statement of rebellion. It had become a quiet act of kindness. Word of Mark's story continued to spread online, not in the form of lawsuits or news headlines anymore, but as part of HOA revenge forums, viral YouTube narrations, and TikToks summarizing the rise and fall of Willow Creek's infamous Karen. People across the country reached out with similar stories, and Mark always gave the same advice. Know the rules better than they do, and when they weaponize the system, beat them at their own game with precision, not rage. What had started as a single truck fine had become a movement. And in that suburban cul-de-sac where silence once reigned under Judith's control, something new had taken root: balance. 6 months had passed since Judith Klein's fall from power, and Willow Creek Estates was almost unrecognizable, not because of new buildings or massive changes to the neighborhood itself, but because of the atmosphere. For the first time in years, the community felt like a place where people lived by choice, not by fear. Children played openly in their yards. Neighbors chatted in driveways without worrying about being cited for standing too close to a property line. Halloween decorations were put up before October without triggering formal complaints. And for the first time in anyone's memory, the HOA actually sent out an email asking for resident feedback, rather than announcing unilateral decisions in all caps, courtesy of Judith. And quietly, over on the edge of the community, the gravel lot remained. The Freedom Lot, as it was now affectionately known, stood as a silent but powerful symbol of what one person could do with enough determination and just the right amount of petty brilliance. It was still neat, still well kept, and still legal. The trucks came and went. An electrician, a landscaper, a mobile detailer, and a handful of others who had found refuge in that small patch of land where HOA rules held no weight. Mark never advertised the lot, never charged rent, never used it as leverage. That had never been the point. He maintained it quietly, spraying for weeds, sweeping gravel back into place, tightening the gate hinges when needed. If a new vehicle showed up, he'd make sure it was parked respectfully and didn't block anyone else. And if someone had a question about zoning or HOA loopholes, he'd answer it, briefly, clearly, and without ceremony. He never wanted to be a neighborhood hero. He just didn't want to be pushed around. But over time, his story became something larger than him. A local YouTuber, known for covering real estate horror stories and HOA drama, did a full expose on the saga, complete with drone footage of the truck yard, screenshots of Judith's emails, and a breakdown of how Mark used legal zoning to outmaneuver HOA authority. The video went viral, gaining millions of views in a matter of weeks. The comments were overwhelming. Thousands of people shared their own HOA nightmares. Threats over mailbox colors, battles over garden gnomes, fines for garage doors left open for too long. But Mark's story gave them something those stories rarely had: a win. A story where common sense and quiet resistance triumphed over tyranny and control. Soon, the lot was no longer just a neighborhood landmark. It became a case study. A community college law professor used the saga in her lectures on land use and municipal authority. A civil liberties organization invited Mark to speak, an invitation he politely declined, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. Even a few local council members reached out to ask about improving the city's policies on HOA oversight and abuse prevention. Meanwhile, Judith's house sat in awkward silence. She hadn't moved, though most expected she would. After all, her carefully curated power structure was gone, and with it, her influence. Occasionally, she was spotted in her backyard, sipping tea on the patio, staring toward the gravel lot that had unraveled everything. She never spoke to Mark again. Not a word, not a wave, not even eye contact. And that was fine with him, because somewhere along the line, the petty revenge had stopped feeling petty. It had become something else, something more useful, more permanent. It was no longer about winning a battle with Judith. It was about drawing a line in the sand, quietly, firmly, and with every truck that rolled across the gravel, reinforcing that boundary. Neighbors began treating the lot like a monument of sorts. Some joked about putting up a plaque. One kid even created a miniature diorama of the HOA versus truck yard story for his middle school history fair. His project won first place. But what mattered most to Mark wasn't the attention. It was the change. The neighborhood had learned something. That rules without compassion become weapons. That silence in the face of power isn't peace, it's surrender. And that sometimes, the most effective way to fight back isn't with shouting or chaos, but with calm, deliberate action that follows every rule and still breaks the system meant to trap you. One morning, as Mark sipped coffee in his backyard, he watched a new truck pull into the lot. A young man in his early 20s, clearly nervous, carefully reversing a trailer into a space. Mark didn't recognize him, but the kid looked around, saw the other trucks parked neatly, and smiled. That smile said everything. It said freedom. It said resistance. It said thank you. Mark raised his mug slightly, more to himself than anyone else. Not in triumph, not in defiance, but in quiet satisfaction. He had parked a truck, then bought a lot, then parked the truth, right where everyone could see it. And no one, not Judith, not the HOA, not the rules, not the fear, could tow it away.